So let's switch the topic a bit because we both happen to live for a moment in the beautiful Duchy of Luxembourg. And it seems a very odd place since it combines sort of the two extremes. So much of its wealth was built on low taxes and having good regulation, which means low regulation on such stuff as asset management, and then all those investment funds would come to Luxembourg and because it was competitive. But on the other hand, it is like a welfare state on steroids with endless supply of money. And I sort of think about the way Milton Friedman said that the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. Is this sort of the problem with Luxembourg, that this perspective of running out of other people's money isn't close enough for people?
By the way, I do think that's a Thatcher quote, another Friedman quote, but we might have to verify that. But I don't think we're going to talk about this, but I love this because I don't get to talk about Luxembourg an awful lot. It's a yeah. I mean, look, I remember like a couple of maybe like 10 years ago, somebody ran the numbers and calculated that if we got 1 more million of high-skilled migrants to Luxembourg, every Luxembourgish person could just work for the government and make a lot of money and not do much. And that's sort of like that kind of thinking I found it fascinating because it encompasses the Luxembourgish spirit. Because not as much through its ingenuity, but a lot by chance and by the fact that the regulation in our neighboring countries was so terrible, Luxembourg has become this financial hub. And nobody in government can really explain to you how that works. Like when they make public transport free of charge, but they call it free, they think that, you know, the money was just there and it was theirs to spend. They don't realize that there's a French hedge fund manager with 8 screens somewhere in the basement of BNP Paribas that made this possible because they don't get it. They really don't understand how the country works, and neither do a lot of Luxembourgish citizens. It's like most Luxembourgish citizens have no understanding of how the country operates. Like, how does this work? They complain about the traffic and all the foreigners who don't speak Luxembourgish, but they don't really understand how the country works. So that's a fundamental problem, because if you go to Singapore, people understand how the country works. They have a clear understanding on where the money comes from. It's also a more educated society. You can say that too, but that's a fundamental problem, and that's where those contradictions come from. Where at the same time that it's still optimistic, an interesting financial hub, but then it also tries to spend money it really doesn't have. I mean, it builds buildings that are way too expensive. And you don't see that expressed yet in like sort of the debt to GDP ratio, even though the debt to GDP ratio has been going up considerably over the last 20 years in Luxembourg. If you compare to the neighbors, well, like, I mean, we still respect the convergence criteria. I mean, who still respects the Maastricht criteria? It's like us and Cyprus and Malta or something. I mean, it's like everyone has completely given up on those years ago, since the financial crisis. So, or the last financial crisis, I should rather say. But it's, yeah, I mean, it's really hard to explain to someone from, like, in the libertarian circles, people always come to me, it's like, oh, you're from Luxembourg, you have no problems. I'd be like, no, not exactly how I'd frame it. Like, we have a lot of education to do. It's just that you don't really get a libertarian sentiment in Luxembourg because most people are financially stable. And that's why you just don't have that interest in those ideas.
Yeah, so one of the countries that people often confuse for Luxembourg is Liechtenstein. And it seems that Luxembourg is doing all the stuff wrong, but Liechtenstein seems to be doing kind of rightish, with Prince, who is very libertarian. He wrote a book that was kind of very libertarian. Do you think that there are some like interesting parallels between the two?
I mean, honestly, I don't know much about Liechtenstein.
Okay, yeah.
But Liechtenstein, unlike Luxembourg, does not try and play in the same league as a country. I mean, it is an independent country, but its currency is the Swiss franc. It relies on Switzerland for most things. It's considerably smaller, both in size and population, than Luxembourg. Liechtenstein doesn't have a foreign minister that goes around in the UN, tries to lecture other countries on how they do their business. Like, Luxembourg is a big country in the body of a small country, and it's it acts that way. So it gets inspiration from its neighbors. The Luxembourgish political class is very inspired by France. The Luxembourgish political class loves to receive the French president and get inspirations from all these beautiful services that the French government provides and how beautiful it's working out, clearly. But it's a different political culture. In Liechtenstein, if they look at their neighbor, it's Switzerland, and if anything, that makes you more libertarian, if that's your influence, right? So and that is because of the constitutional system in Switzerland, which we could talk about for hours and probably not the right time. But Luxembourg doesn't have quite that culture. It doesn't have the same history in that sense as well, and I think that's where it comes from.
So in a way, Luxembourg is filled with all those kind of Byzantine projects. And I think one of the biggest ones is the supposedly free public transport, which of course runs on volunteers. There are no paid drivers, free trams, free buses we get, but grow on trees. So this is how we can do it. Is Luxembourg in a way making other countries follow stupid ideas like this because they seem to work in here?
Well, they really loved getting the headlines on that, and they really loved, oh, we're the first country that makes public transport free, and so on and so on. I mean, to be fair, the ticket sales in public transport made up about 1/3 of the running costs of the public transport system. So it wasn't that big of a leap. I mean, if anything, the conclusion should have been to make public transport more expensive. I mean, so if you take the tram in Amsterdam, I think it's a really cool system because, I mean, it's still deficitary, but not quite as much as it was in Luxembourg. But you beep in with your card and you beep out, so you only pay for what you used. That kind of a system makes a lot more sense, and it's also adjusted to sort of the overall pricing conditions, the overall inflation level. Malta has actually become, since, the second country to make public transport free. But for those people who are interested, you can read up on the buses in Malta. The buses in Malta are so dangerous that even the guy in charge of running them wouldn't send his own son on a bus trip in Malta because they're just so in disrepair. And I think, even though that won't happen in Luxembourg because we will spend too much money on everything, just because you made it free doesn't mean it serves people in the way it's supposed to. If anything, your bus driver, if now he's 15 minutes late and you get in, it's like, hey, you're late, he'll be like, oh, it's not like you paid something for it, right? You didn't get a ticket. So you don't have that customer and service relationship, because if people pay for something, they have an expectation. They try to, for that expectation to be met. But for most people who are employees, for who income tax is deducted before they just receive a net salary, they don't even know how much taxes either they pay or the employer paid to hire them. So they don't have that relationship with those services. And as a result of that, I expect that those services will get a lot worse in Luxembourg, because now, so what? I mean, it's already paid for, we already, the money came from somewhere, so whatever. And that goal of getting people to switch to public transport, making that more efficient, it's just not there. And, I'm not a huge car geek. In Luxembourg, you kind of need a car because the public transport system just isn't where it is. If you're trying to go out at night, the taxis cost a fortune because it's run by one big monopoly. If anything, like there is a real need here. You would make the country so much better if the public transport system, if Luxembourg City had a metro system, for instance. I think that would really help. Bonn has a metro system. Why shouldn't Luxembourg, right? So there's all these infrastructure needs, but instead they do these these cosmetic changes on how much the ticket is, or that the ticket doesn't exist anymore. It's like, that doesn't solve anything. You just moved money from A to B. Like that doesn't create anything. There's no creation there. There's no support for people there in any sense.
Yeah, in a way, I find Luxembourgish politics very depressing, because there's like no way anything changes. There's like no big perspective on anything getting better. So like in 2021, there was this debate in Luxembourgish parliament about the wine that was served on the state-owned airline, and it wasn't Luxembourgish enough for the airline. So there was just this focus on nonsense, and there just doesn't seem to be any problem that could drive any real change.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, and by the way, I think that was the question on. I think they served French champagne. No, they served Luxembourgish Crémant, and then they stopped to serve French
Mm.
champagne or Italian Prosecco or something. These are the kind of things that they get busy with in Parliament. Um, I mean, honestly, if they're distracted by these kind of details, that's not always a bad thing. There used to be this sort of veteran socialist member of parliament in Luxembourg, and he would often fall asleep. And I would always say, like, why are you complaining about him sleeping? Please don't wake him up. If he wakes up, he'll have all sorts of ideas to do. And that would be really, like, honestly, members of parliament should have as few sessions as possible. Sleep in the chamber. I really don't care. Just don't get any ideas. That's the problem with the European Parliament. There's 751 members of the European Parliament. No wonder they come up with regulation and ideas to amend regulation all the time, because what else are they going to do, right? So that in Luxembourg, the system should actually be incentivized to do as little as possible. 90% of votes in the Luxembourgish Parliament are unanimous. So there you can see, like, I mean, there's no real debate happening. There's no two sides. It's all just one big group of people with these tiny parties. I mean, not even the communist, like the Marxist party isn't even fully Marxist, and the right-wing party is like a joke of a right-wing party, if anything, and the liberals are definitely not liberals. The Greens are Greens, at least. You got to give them that. I mean, they're the authentic version, but it's yeah. I mean, I don't follow Parliament much anymore. I don't get much from it, to be honest.